Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming today to this Carnegie Middle East Center event on creating basically security architecture for the region and the potential, basically looking at the potential of security architecture in the region. It's very useful and refreshing looking at that, given the massive influx of news and threats of regional conflict and the talk about a potential of war in this region. So, with us today we have Tanasi Kambani, a senior fellow at the Century Foundation, David Griffiths, an independent researcher and the former Canadian naval officer, also Dalia Kay, the director of the Center for Middle East Public Policy and a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation. I mean, this is basically the subject of the book that we are going to discuss, which is The Order from Ashes, New Foundations for Security in the Middle East, which is edited by Michael Hanna and Tanasi, who's with us today. So, the gentleman and lady here have actually written 3 insightful chapters in this edited book. So let me just start with Tanasi, given the news element in his chapter is very newsy, and it's related to the ongoing events, especially with the threats between Hezbollah and the Israelis about the upcoming conflict. You've spoken about this channel between Hezbollah and Israel, which is basically the UNIFIL. What do you think would be the role of UNIFIL in any future conflict, which is becoming more and more plausible given
future conflict might be a contemporary conflict for those of us who live here any day. Before I answer your question, Mohammed, let me first say thank you for hosting us here at Carnegie. Thanks to you and the Carnegie Middle East Center for hosting the launch of Order from Ashes, which is an effort that was born in a slightly more optimistic time a few years ago to imagine what the foundations for a reconstituted Middle East security architecture could look like after decades of atrophy. And I'm sure this will come up repeatedly in our conversation today. This is a region that has the least developed security architecture among world regions, and it's very much out of kilter with the level of political development and, of course, the level of conflict that we experience. So you asked me about UNIFIL, and the study I made of UNIFIL was to look at UNIFIL's role as a standing communications channel between 2 belligerents. And this is in a region that is hosted, in some cases, decades-long ongoing wars. There's surprisingly little institutionalized communication between belligerents. It's something we see a lot at the very local level, for example, between frontline militias in Syria. They'll talk to each other over the radios, but then there's almost no default place where the leadership of belligerents can even sort out technical battlefield issues, prisoner exchanges, temporary ceasefires, the kinds of things that always come up in conflict management. So it's an aberration that on this particularly tense border, we have this UN mission, this peacekeeping mission, that almost by accident on purpose, set up this tripartite process. It was set up in 2006 to help manage the retreat of Israeli soldiers and the entry of the Lebanese armed forces into the south for the first time after the end of the Israeli occupation in 2000. And so in the process of coordinating a staged retreat where the Israelis would pull out, UN would come in, and then the Lebanese would come in and take their place, they came up with a process where the Lebanese army, the Lebanese military, and the Israeli military would meet under UN auspices and talk about these technical matters. Since then, in the almost 13 years since August 2006, or I guess almost 12 years since then, they've had more than 100 meetings, and they've developed this strangely effective face-to-face discussion forum where the officers from both sides at a very senior level sit in the same room and resolve technical problems, demarcation of the blue line, and they've gone so far in some cases as to try and take on some of the bigger issues of the conflict. So the tripartite group actually the military officers on both sides came up with a plan for Rajar, the disputed village that is claimed by Lebanon, but occupied by Israel, and whose residents are sort of ambiguously happy with their status under Israeli occupation. They came up with a settlement plan, but of course it never was embraced by the political leadership on either side. And what we can get more into this in the discussion if it's of interest, but what I was asking is what's the utility of this channel, and can it actually solve the major security and political problems along this border? And what my research suggests is that in fact no, it can't. It's a very useful forum for avoiding unwanted escalation. So if Israel or Hezbollah want to avoid a war, the existence of these UN channels will prevent them or help prevent them from going to war by accident when neither side wants to go to war.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about if you can just describe to us a little bit the meeting, because you speak about these meetings which happen on a frequent basis. And I think now there has been reports that it's been daily. So the meetings between the Lebanese Army, the Israeli Army, and the UNIFIL.
So, and it's important to remember, Hezbollah is not in the room at these meetings, right? So even though the two important parties here are the Israeli military and Hezbollah, but in the room is the Lebanese armed forces and the Israelis. So what happens is there's a small square room in Nakura on I'm not sure if it's actually literally on the border, but it's been described to me as being on the border, and I haven't been allowed into this room. Maybe some people in this room have been in that room and can pitch in. And the commanders of UNIFIL sit along one wall, and facing them are the UNIFIL staff, and then along another wall are the Israelis, and on another wall are the Lebanese. And apparently the Israelis, when they speak, will address the Lebanese directly, and when the Lebanese answer, they speak to the UNIFIL commander. But they're in the same room, they're all talking English, and they'll address the UNIFIL commander, and then the Israelis will answer. And then at lunchtime, they do not mingle, by all accounts. They eat off the same buffet table, but they don't chit-chat. But by all accounts, what has emerged is a level of technical trust between these two sides. And the Lebanese side has very tight and credible lines of contact with Hezbollah. So they, anything that concerns Hezbollah, they make clear where, we talk to them before we come in, we find out what's possible, then we have this meeting, and then anything that's going to be potentially agreed, we take it back to them and check it with them, which is, a form of indirect diplomacy, and it can be very effective, for example, in, the tensions that have recently arisen as Israel has started building walls along the blue line. So this is a contested boundary, it's not a border. They're building a wall on this unadjudicated line, and it will be a potential cause of war if they build a wall on territory that's claimed by Lebanon. So far, they've only built it on their own undisputed territory. But as these disagreements come up, these are the kinds of things that are discussed in that room and potentially can diffuse an unwanted escalation. But the minute either side wants to go to war, and this was your starting question, how is this going to help us when the war comes? When Israel decides it's time to strike, or when Hezbollah decides it wants to escalate somehow, and the answer is nothing. They can't do a damn thing. And the more specific question I had in this research was, what about when the war happens? Can they help evacuate civilians from the war zone? And that will depend on whether Hezbollah and Israel are willing to work with them. And Hezbollah doesn't even communicate with them now. And the Israelis have shown a very distant arm's length when it comes to any kind of give or take with this UN brokered process. So my sense is we can take something useful from this, but really very low expectations about what this kind of channel can provide, because a real effective channel between belligerents needs to be political and needs to have buy-in from political leadership. If you have technically adept soldiers coming and telling the politicians, hey, this could work, and the politicians don't want to do anything with it, it ends there.
Thank you. I'm just going to move to a subject which is very much connected to the question of war between Lebanon and Israel, and basically regional conflict. Dalia, you've spoken in your chapter about the potential or the possibility of the U.S. withdrawing from the Iran deal. It's due in May 12, I think, the waiver, the sanctions waiver. So basically, in the case, if the United States withdrew from that deal, what could the EU backers of that deal do, especially in light of recent Iranian statements saying that we will withdraw as well from that deal if the Americans do? So how do you see these political maneuvers and then the potential in succeeding?
Okay, well, thank you, and thanks to Carnegie for having us. I will answer the Iran deal question. I have been focused quite a bit on that, but to be fair, since we are doing the book launch, I just want to add one point on the excellent example of the UNIFIL. Your point of, well, it can only stop unintended war. Well, in the Middle East, when you have no conflict resolution mechanisms, an outlier globally with absolutely no communication among adversaries, the Iran deal was, one of those exceptions, but looks like it's close to collapsing. That's actually not a bad thing. And so one of the things my chapter in this study did was to look back at previous experiences, try to think about how you can move from just a purely collective security architecture where it's all about competitive balancing, zero-sum thinking, which is just the reality of the Middle East. That's not going to change overnight. And how you can start taking these incremental confidence-building steps at the technical level. Obviously, nothing in the Middle East is just technical. Everything's politicized. So you need political will, you need political resolution of the core conflicts, Israel-Palestine being the most critical, to get any of these things really to move further. But these are not small steps. And in the early 90s, we actually saw a lot of progress. And then I take some lessons, and we can get to that. On the Iran deal, I think, I was not one of those starting in October when the U.S. President Trump decertified the Iranian agreement. Now, a lot of people at the time said, it's just a symbolic move. This is no big deal. The adults in the room will keep things going because, IAEA and has consistently suggested through multiple reports that there has been no violation of this agreement by the Iranians. However, even though the October decision was just symbolic because it was just in terms of responding to a U.S. law, it has set a chain of events in motion that I believe is leading to the unraveling of the deal. And the next decision point is May 12th. The last critical juncture was mid-January when President Trump basically issued an ultimatum to our European partners. Some I think are in the room. I see some old friends. And essentially said, fix the deal or this time we're really out. And the way the U.S. would leave is to stop waiving the nuclear-related sanctions that actually would put the U.S. in violation of the agreement. I've been recently participating. I had a paper out. Rand did it with 3 other European think tanks. And what we tried to do was figure out, is there a way to salvage this agreement? Is there a package, basically a transatlantic bargain that's possible? Can the Europeans get tougher on Iran in other areas, missiles, sunset clauses, inspections, some of it through the agreement, some of it outside the agreement, that would be enough for the Trump administration to stay in the deal, but not touch the deal itself, because for the Europeans, that's a red line. Because this deal is not just a deal by the United States. It's not just a deal between the White House and Congress. It's an international agreement. Russia, China, and of course, Iran has to agree to it. So we try to figure out if there's a bargain. We laid out some ideas. The question is, would it be enough for the Trump administration? And that's not clear. If I had to predict, I think it would be very smart to be planning. A plan B would be very smart. The Europeans are actively thinking about a plan B, how they could keep this deal alive. From the European perspective, this is one of their most important foreign policy achievements. And the argument about why the deal was good in the first place was not because of a belief that Iran wasn't going to be up to some a malign behavior in the region, but that you would not want some of that behavior under the specter of a nuclear weapon. So the agreement kind of put a lid on that. The Europeans do not want this to unravel, so they will most likely try to protect their own companies, potentially through blocking sanctions. They would reconstitute sanctions that would protect their companies from secondary sanctions from the United States. It gets very complicated, but we've seen it before in the 90s with Helms-Burton. This worked. The Europeans threatened U.S. companies if they would enforce secondary sanctions on their companies investing in Iran, so that's what they would try to do. Not clear they're going to have the leverage this time around. The U.S. market is very important. What they may try to do instead, and we argue this in our piece, is they may try to kind of create a soft exit for the United States. So try to bargain with the Trump administration, at least waive the enforcement of the secondary sanctions to let Europe and other powers continue the investment in Iran, because ultimately the nuclear agreement is nuclear rollback for incentives, economic incentives for the Iranians. And if the Iranians are not getting the economic incentives, which they're already arguing they're not, if Europe is not able to continue that investment, then why would the Iranians continue to adhere to this agreement? And they will not be the ones blamed. The United States will be blamed, both for a trade war and for the collapse of the agreement. So we're in a really, I would say, precarious state. May is going to be a big month in the Middle East.
Yeah, we have 2 elections as well.
We have 2 elections. We have the decision on Jerusalem, which is also could provoke quite a bit of instability. Everything's coming in May. So I think, prevented unwanted war would not be a bad start in the current climate in the region.
David, you point out that the MENA states managed impressive progress on maritime cooperation before talks broke down in the 1990s. But even if civilian cooperation were achieved in matters such as search and rescue, incidents at sea, piracy, how could it translate into cooperation between navies or security forces? And you're yourself a former naval officer, so you have first-hand experience with these incidents.
Yeah, let me emphasize, I don't claim to be an expert on Middle East issues. I was involved, however, in the Middle East peace process between 93 and 95. And I remember this image in my mind when it began to fail at the end of 2 men scrambling up a sandbank, almost making it to the top, and then losing traction and sliding down again. And, it reminds me of Albert Einstein defined insanity as repeating the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And so thinking new thoughts about security. If you're going to reimagine a security architecture, you have to kind of look at some of the basic assumptions. Security, for example. We tend to confuse security with defense. Well, defense is a capability. It means that I can defend myself if you attack me. Security is something different. Many years ago, I went to South Africa, and while I was there, I went to visit a friend who he was quite well off, a white man in black South Africa. So we went to his home, which was behind walls in a gated community with armed guards at the gate. And I remember thinking at the time, who feels more secure? The person living behind these walls with the armed guards, or people who live in the little village in Nova Scotia where my parents are buried, where they will laugh at you if you lock your car. They never lock their houses. So who feels more secure? What is security? So when I look at any English language dictionary, definition of security always has that word confidence in it. So we need to look at security. And the chapter goes on at some detail of this. But back to your point about the maritime side. The maritime, I don't know about Lebanon, but I know in Canada and in most countries, politicians tend not to think about the ocean. They forget about it. We think land. And yet, it's incredibly important. aside from the fact it covers 70% of the Earth's surface, 90% of the trade by volume goes by sea. Think of how critically vital sea lanes are, the Suez Canal, the Gulf of Hormuz. Even such things that you wouldn't think about, most of the world's internet doesn't go by satellite, it goes by optical cables undersea. I think it was in 2008, 2 of these cables got ruptured off Alexandria. And all of a sudden, Egypt was almost without internet. The Gulf, India, Pakistan, all cut off from North America because of these 2 undersea cables. The sea is important. The other thing about the sea, however, is that it creates a society. A scholar would call it an epistemic community. But a society of sailors who have a culture, a common culture of mariner that bridges international boundaries. I remember during the Cold War saying to a Polish naval officer that if it wasn't for the language, I would have more in common with you as a Polish naval officer than I do with a Canadian fighter pilot. There is that epistemic community. Mariners, from time immemorial, have cooperated. The sea has been a channel of trade. Long before there were international agreements, sailors had customs and traditions among themselves which allowed for trade and cooperation. Naval ships have always had standards of courtesy that is exchanged in times of peace. Now we have a constitution for the oceans and the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. Mariners have been communicating internationally through a code of signals that has been developed since the 1850s. Mariners maneuver under a code of regulations that have been around since the 1800s. So mariners are used to interacting. It is not unusual for warships to cross paths at sea. It is unusual for armed divisions of troops to cross paths. It is perfectly legal for a naval vessel to steam within the territorial waters of another country if it is on what's defined as innocent passage. You don't have innocent passage of armed divisions of troops. So there is a society, there's precedent at sea that I think offers a lot of potential models upon which we can build. And one of the biggest, one of the most important, I think, is arrangements for prevention of incidents at sea. There are some 45 years of experience in this around the world, beginning with the US-Soviet agreement, but has since expanded around the world. During the Middle East peace process in 93, 95, and Delia, you may be able to correct me if I'm wrong on this, but within that, there was an arms control and regional security working group. Within that, Canada was asked to mentor the maritime issues. And we undertook 2 things. One was prevention of incidents between navies. The other was the international humanitarian obligation for search and rescue. Not nice to do, obligation. So the Canadian Navy was kind of mentoring, chairing the incidents at sea part, Coast Guard, search and rescue. I believe that I am correct in saying that by the time that peace process ended, the only agreement that had been completed, was ready to sign, all of the parties were happy with it, it was just waiting for political approval, was an agreement to prevent incidents at sea in the Middle East. The document is probably still there somewhere in people's files. It was done. All it needed was political approval. When the peace process collapsed, the Canadian government, with support from the US, was very concerned that this momentum not be lost. Therefore, we established what became known as a Maritime Safety Colloquium, in which we would bring Israel, Arab neighbors together each year to talk about maritime safety issues. I actually left the Navy to coordinate this as a civilian. We stressed safety because that's non-political. We also stressed the fact that our job was not to solve political problems. It was to do practical, technical safety things at sea. What our colleague Peter Jones, who's also written a chapter for this book, would have called political space. In other words, politicians say, look, you technical people get in there, sort it out, don't stray beyond this box, but handle it. And for a period of 7 years, between 1997 and 2004, we met every year, Israel, Arab neighbors, Israel, Palestinians. And perhaps to give you the sense, we were talking about the who talks to who. Once you can get sailors in the same room, doing practical things, a lot of the political national concerns drop aside. We ran an exercise at the Canadian Coast Guard College, which has a mock-up of a rescue coordination center. And we started running an exercise on an oil rig explosion and everybody cooperating.
It's very relevant now, given the oil exploration.
Exactly.
In the sea.
But I can tell you that within 20 minutes of this exercise running, Israelis were shouting at Palestinians on mock radios about, we need a helicopter over here, and the Jordanians and the Egyptians and the guys from the Gulf were working cooperatively. There is that tradition among sailors of working together, which I think is it provides useful precedent and useful models. But again, you ask, how can that be applied now? For 7 years, this thing ran. There are something like 140, I think, alumni of this. It ceased operating not because of any problem in the region. It was a Canadian bureaucratic problem, which Delia mentions in one of her books. But people worked together very well for 7 years. Why not recreate it? I can think of others, but I don't want to hog the platform here.
Diana, you also spoke about the difference and the nuance between collective security and cooperation over security matters. I mean, what kind of forum, which is broad and inclusive, you can envisage in that? Because you also narrated the history of these failed attempts for the 1960s, the Arab League, leading to the GCC efforts in the 80s and 90s. Can you just tell us a little bit about that nuance and how we can, move from collective security into cooperation?
Yeah, well, I think that the relatively good news story David's outlining is an example of cooperative security, where it's about confidence building, it's not about ending conflicts. No regional architecture in the Middle East is probably going to be able to accomplish that, so we should set expectations realistically. No regional architecture is going to end the war in Syria or Yemen, but maybe you can prevent future catastrophes like these, or at least contain the devastation of them if they're going to start. But the history in the Middle East of cooperation is not a happy one, and we see it to this day. The default option in the Middle East is going to be competitive alliances, often in the Middle East, it's been directed against countries, Iraq in the 80s, Iran, 90s, 2000s. Today, Iran is a common theme. But what we see again and again is a failure because the Middle East is not Europe. You're not going to get an Arab NATO. You're not going to get a Muslim NATO. There's too many fissures within the Middle East, both within the Arab world. I don't need to go over after the summit last May to counter terrorism. There was supposed to be a new big Muslim alliance and Arab alliance against counterterrorism, and a week later you have the GCC rift. Not to mention the differences between the Arab states and Turkey and when it comes to political Islam. So the fissures are so serious, the alliances are ever shifting. Just within the conflicts of the Middle East, the alliances are different. To this day, depending on whether you're talking about Libya or you're talking about Syria, there's different. So I think the idea that you're going to build some durable system on a competitive regional alliance arrangement is the wrong way to go. Unfortunately, that tends to be the default option, frankly, of U.S. policy in the region, many of our allies' policy in the region, and I think it's short-sighted. I think it will not prevent war. I think it will just continue fueling instability. And what we should be moving toward are building on these experiences from the past that are more limited, but have shown to be successful. The only last word I would say on that, to be realistic, is we have to learn some of the key lessons, which means we have to stop linking regional architecture to political processes. Yes, everything will get politicized, but the anchor of these previous efforts were always linked either to the peace process or to the NPT. In either case, you're not going to get anywhere. And in a lot of ways, it actually is an opportunity right now. I guess you can tell I'm not a big believer in the ultimate deal, but even if you had the ultimate deal, too many issues in the region are not related to the Arab-Israeli conflict. I don't need to tell people sitting here in Beirut about the devastation of the Syrian conflict. That involves every single actor in the region. I think we need to start thinking about different kinds of issues, less traditional security issues. I think migration and refugees would be one. And we need to stop excluding parties from these processes. especially parties that are active in all of these conflicts. I would say namely Iran, which was excluded in these efforts in the 90s. If you exclude actors like this, they will become spoilers. It is not smart. So I think we can learn some lessons from the past, hopefully not make some of the same mistakes with the definition of insanity, and maybe move the ball forward a little bit.
And you also see, yeah, please go ahead.
You just mentioned about exclusion. One of the things about that Track 2 process, the Maritime Safety Colloquium, is in fact, I think everybody was involved. Iran never actually turned up simply because the people that were going to come one year had a visa problem. But because it was safety, because it was away from within a political space, everyone was able to meet. There was a guy some years ago called Dossinger who wrote a book called Why Nations Go to War. I think it's now in its 10th printing. But he did a series of case studies on wars and tried to pick out what caused wars to happen. And of all of the factors that he identified, above all, in every case, was misperception. Either a misperception about what we are thinking, what they are thinking, what their capabilities are ours. In every case, misperception. And certainly, from my own research, I would say the same thing. Which is why communication becomes so important. It doesn't matter if I agree with you. It doesn't even matter if I hate you. But we need to be able to communicate, and particularly to communicate when things get tense. It is, if you're intending to go to war, well, nothing will stop that, fine. But that is not in a political best interest. Wars never turn out the way people who start them want them to. The law of unintended consequences is always there. So preventing war is not just a nice thing to do, it's a political imperative. And the best way to do that is to make sure there is clear communications. And I could talk on about that as well, but I don't want to hog the stage.
Tanasi about basically this channel of communication which is devoid of politics between Israel and the Lebanese Army, and why do you think this is important? Why is it important to speak?
The benefit of a UN channel is, for example, after the clash in Edessa, or more recently in, I think, 2015 in the Golan, where fire is exchanged, and you have these, in the first case, you have UNIFIL able to convene an emergency meeting and get the IDF and the LAF into the room, and they were able, first of all, to enforce a cooling off period, and then to ascertain that neither side actually wanted to start a war at that point, and both sides privately told UNIFIL that was the case, and then they were able to then come up with a face-saving solution. In the more complex incident in which there was fire in the Syrian Golan and then retaliation from Lebanon, the UN was able, not just UNIFIL, but also UNSCOL here in Beirut, was able to make contact with Iranian politicians and with Israeli politicians, and essentially pass messages, and there isn't another space where that can happen. So this is where it can play a useful role. But let's back up to the bigger question, like what's going to start the next war, or what's likely to start the next war? Well, one major factor is opacity about what each side actually, what its intentions are and what its capabilities are. So we have two belligerents who have made an endless, tiresome methodology of fear-mongering and psyops to say we're willing to accept destroying all our own population centers and destroying all of yours and committing these war crimes. We don't care. We're willing to go to destroy ourselves in favor of this war. We hear this coming from Israeli politicians and military officials. We hear this sometimes, mirrors of this kind of rhetoric coming from Hezbollah, and no one knows what do they really actually believe their capabilities are. Is this a posture, or do they have these new advanced capabilities that make them feel like they have new deterrent capacities that change the balance of power? This is make sure you take a book on the way out. These are capabilities that can only really be proven by fighting it out, and God knows that's awful for the rest of us. I mean, if you're going to resolve this question by having that war, well, in the end, then who had how many rockets and who really did have air defense capability and who really could shoot down an airplane. But you have tens of thousands of dead people or worse at the end of this. And this is something that a politically vested process, which UNIFIL is not, could accomplish. They could actively behind the scenes work to ascertain what the real positions of these two actors are, and then in private, if for example, in reality, neither of these sides wants to have a war, then they could, in a face-saving way, communicate that. If there were real reservation points, of all the things we talk about in public, here are the two things that actually we do consider a cause of war. And then, if that kind of accurate information could pass back and forth, maybe one of the belligerents would say, hey, we feel pretty secure with these 8 things we did, and we're willing to withdraw these other 2 to avoid a war. That's never going to happen in public. That can't happen in, there's not a forum like NATO in which that can happen. There's no credible actor like the United States or Russia who's trusted by all the parties involved who can play this role. So who plays that role? And the terrifying answer is nobody. So we're all left reading media reports and parsing statements and trying to figure out, how to parse this gap. And UNIFIL and UNSCOL are ill-equipped to do the kind of serious brokering that could de-escalate this conflict or manage it when it really breaks out.
Can I just add, though, I think, U.S. and Russia are really important in this just because they do have communications with the 2 key parties here who could potentially go to war. And I think one of the lessons...
The U.S. doesn't have communications with Hezbollah.
No, I'm saying the Russians can, and the U.S. obviously with Israel. And the U.S. and Russia are de facto regional players. And so one of the lessons from the earlier episodes of cooperation is that you had the extra-regional, we called them extra-regionals in the multilateral peace process in the 90s. They're still, I guess, extra-regional, but they really are regional powers, and they need whatever process or form we could figure out how to convene. They have to be part of it, and they may be part of the solution as well if it's done multilaterally, not if it's done bilateral. It has to be kind of a process that gives political cover with maybe the UN as the neutral party. So there's ways to think about it. I think, trying to prevent an Israeli-Hezbollah war is probably a really hard test for relaunching a security architecture in the Middle East. I wouldn't start there. But of course, everyone in this room hopes that. Over, right? We're all hoping for the best, but that's going to be very difficult. I think that's a bar that's very high.
You actually see opportunities in these conflicts resulting in some sort of security dialogue, a broad security dialogue. I mean, we're, let's say, in Libya and Syria, the major conflicts in the region, in Yemen. How do you see these, creating these opportunities for some sort of a security forum or some talks on security between the various actors and potentially leading to some sort of a security architecture which is required in this region?
I'll let David fill in details of some of the examples of that would happen in the 90s, but of course there's opportunities because actors want a way out because there's no end game here for most of these parties. What's the end game in Yemen? What's the end? Well, I think there may be an end game, some see in Syria, but even there's very high cost. And so I think when there's these very costly wars with huge socioeconomic pressures facing most of these leaders, and that was an issue earlier as well, this isn't an issue of altruism. People are not, countries and leaders are not engaging in these security forums because they're doing their adversaries a favor. They're doing it for their own survival because they're looking for an alternative. I think, as David said, you need to reimagine a different option. And so to do that, you need a vision for the region that isn't just about, we're going to counter this bad guy who's doing all this horrible stuff. And this is the source of all instability in the region. That's not a vision. That's who you're countering at any given point in time. That's not going to get you out of these conflicts. That's not going to help you deliver the socioeconomic goods that you need to be delivering to your own people to survive in today's Middle East with the demographic and socioeconomic pressures that these leaders are facing. So, I'm just keeping it big picture. I'll let David think about details, but I do think that there are opportunities in this without being naive.
One final question, basically, and I'll be happy if you can also chip in on that, given the recent changes in the Middle East process, Middle East peace process, one, the Trump declaration on Jerusalem, which is, devastating for the peace process, and then the Hamas-Fatah rift, and also the changes in terms of the various Arab powers making some sort of rapprochement towards Israel, some sort of normalization. So do you think we will see some sort of increased polarization, two blocks, Arab states who are, basically a few Arab states who are uniting against, in a front against the Israelis, and then on the other hand you have these Arab states and their bloc, which is normalizing relations with the Israelis regardless of the peace process. How would that evolve into more conflict and more instability in the region? And how do you think, a security architecture that we're discussing here could be useful?
I'll start because I have the least to say and on this, and I think Dalia and David both have a lot to add. One of the notable things in everything you just mentioned is that none of these processes, including the weird emergence of a Gulf-Israel bloc, have resulted in any kind of meaningful institution or architecture. So even with all the shifts that have taken place, some of which can be interpreted as awful, some people are happy with them, but in no case have they even produced open diplomatic relations or secret but established channels or institutions or a red line phone, like any of the things that become useful regardless of the political outcome haven't come with it. So we've paid, in this case, we've paid a price of awful U.S. positions on the Middle East peace process, and throwing away the role, any pretense of being an honest broker. Now, Trump has even more firmly embraced the not just the Israeli side, but the Likud Israeli view of the world, and yet there's no collateral benefit, right? That one could have seen all these things happen and said, well, at least as a result of this, we got a secretariat of something. We got an office of something else. We got a Mediterranean garbage forum where Mediterranean waterfront nations. Right. I mean, if that existed, right? If there was an office in Malta, where Lebanese, Turks, Israelis, and Egyptians all, occasionally got together to talk about garbage and pollution in the Mediterranean, that would be useful. Would it solve all our problems? No, but it would be better than nothing. We haven't even gotten those kinds of baby steps out of this disaster. And I think that's, again, why we come back to the question of architecture. Why are we in such poor shape here?
And we were discussing some of that sort of thing in the Maritime Safety Colloquium, so it can be done.
And David, what about India, Pakistan? I mean, you have I think that if you're going to look for examples around the world, Europe is a very institutionalized model for security cooperation. It may not be the best place to start. Asia, especially South Asia, with very serious adversarial relations between India and Pakistan, I think there's some lessons there, maybe.
Very much so, and in the Western Pacific, East Asia as well. There's a process going on now, for example, in the South China Sea, where the navies have a perfectly good arrangement now for prevention of incidents. But the problem in the South China Sea is not navies. It's coast guards, it's fisheries protection. And so they don't have this international mindset. They're national law enforcement people. And so there is, in fact, a project going on now which is trying to take some of those lessons from the naval experience and apply it to the specific circumstance of maritime law enforcement people. I mention it because it's just another example of how each region has to think through what its own needs are. But there is a wealth of lessons out there. Dalia mentioned the India-Pakistan process. For about 14 years, retired admirals from India and Pakistan met each year, about half of whom were former heads of the respective navies, now private citizens, but very influential at home. Each year we would meet, I say we, I chaired this, Peter Jones, who also is one of the authors, was involved. Each year we would meet in some place away from the region, in Bangkok or Colombo. And these senior officers would talk together about problems now as private citizens, well connected and understanding their national positions. None of them doves, all hawks. I told Tanasi actually over coffee, when we first met, we were introducing ourselves, and one of the Indians during the 1971 war had been on one of two Indian ships that was attacked by a Pakistani submarine. One of the Indian ships sank, the other rescued survivors. The Indian officer said, I was the executive officer of the ship that survived, and I helped pull them out of the water. The executive officer of the other ship was my friend. And he said, I keep in touch with his wife, who has never accepted he's dead. She just refuses to admit it. One of the Pakistanis said, I was in that submarine. I gave the order to fire. And he said, if I can do anything to help her with closure, I will do that. The two of them went off in a corner. They talked. They came back arm in arm, and very much set the tone for our discussions from there on in. We had met initially to talk about prevention of incidents at sea. The politicians back in the 1990s had said they were going to create one. Nothing ever happened. So our initial plan was to see if we could get that rolling. But at the very first meeting, we started talking about imprisoned fishermen. There's a disputed maritime boundary. So they were doing tit-for-tat arrests of fishermen. So one country would arrest, the other country would arrest. There were hundreds of these people in jail, some of them for years. And around the table, these human beings, now speaking to each other as maritime professionals, said, why are we doing this? We're just creating a humanitarian problem for each other. To make a long story short, about 3 or 4 months later, some 600 prisoners were released because it was that they were able to go home and had credibility. As another example, again, I mentioned this to Irtanasi over coffee. I once received a blind copy of an email from one side or the other. And this was before the Mumbai attacks, and it was saying, our two delegations are meeting at the moment in New Delhi. Your delegation has not yet asked our delegation about a certain topic. If your delegation were to ask our delegation, they might be happy. Several days later, I see in the newspaper there's a breakthrough new agreement between India and Pakistan on that particular issue. Back home, people said to me, were you part of that? I said, yep. Why don't they mention you in the newspaper? Because if they did, it would never have happened. This is an achievement of politicians. But it was quietly crafted by people who care and with influence from the ground up. I could see that as a very good model here in the Middle East, perhaps regenerating some of the friendships that occurred back in the 90s and early 2000s. People with some influence who care, who have credibility with the political leadership, because this is not going against political leadership. It is helping political leaders do what the responsibility of politics is, to keep people safe and secure, not war. And as an aside, we have got to get rid of this culture that war is somehow noble. That was fine right up to 1914, where people would go marching off to war in fancy uniforms and look forward to fleet battles. And then armies found that a thing called the machine gun made advancing impossible, so you ended up with the trenches. Navies, looking forward to the big fleet action, discovered there was now something called a submarine, which almost starved Britain to death in 1917. There are now things called airplanes. The world changed between 1914 and 1918. And this was recognized in the 1920s. People will sometimes scoff at the treaty that was written at the time that basically made war illegal. And people tend to scoff at it because they said a few years later you had World War II. But think about it. People recognize that this is now a crime. The United Nations Charter says that war is illegal. We've all agreed to that. We've all signed up to it. And so we have to get our culture of war, we need to start thinking differently about it. There are things worth fighting for. There are times when one must fight. But if that happens, you're opening up the door to unintended consequences, and nobody's going to win. We talk about nuclear weapons, and there are some actually good examples that come from some of the nuclear things in the Cold War, and people say, well, that's nuclear warfare. We don't have that here. Well, a weapon of mass destruction, how do you define that? In Rwanda, in the 1990s, 800,000 people were killed, mostly by machetes. 800,000 people. A machete is a weapon of mass destruction. We need to start thinking differently about war. And we need to think about unintended consequences. There was an example. During the Cold War, there are at least 2 occasions that I know of where a rapid decision made by a relatively junior officer, in one case a naval commander, in the other case lieutenant colonel, had they decided differently, there would have been World War III. I give one example in the book. But I've said this to political people. Look, prime ministers and presidents are sitting around a table thinking that they control things, but life is chaotic, especially at sea. And if one lieutenant colonel had made a different decision, you would be sitting in nuclear rubble if you were sitting there at all. We need to be thinking differently. We need to communicate. We need to make sure that we have no misperception. That's vital. So all kinds of models, there are others. Read the book.
Thank you. Shall we move to the questions from the audience? Please raise your hand. Shall we start from here? Can you just take the mic, please?
Hi, Dalia. About the Iran nuclear deal, you thought in October when you heard about it, you didn't think it was serious. But today, knowing the North Korean overture and the talks that the U.S. is going to be holding with the North Korean about their nuclear deal, do you think still that the Americans will pull out of a nuclear deal in exchange for economic empowerment when they're trying to negotiate the same exact thing with another rogue government?
Yes, I think it's a feasible possibility. My view hasn't changed, actually. I think this isn't necessarily a strategic decision. The Jerusalem decision was not a strategic decision. We have some decisions, not all decisions. A lot of U.S. foreign policy now is delegated to the Department of Defense, and whether you like it or not, it's based on military strategy. Certain decisions, especially decisions that the president campaigned on, policy issues, are driven by a variety of considerations. So I think you need to take the threat, I think we all need to take the threat seriously. I said it back in October. I believe it even more now. I don't think North Korea will change that equation. There are some people even arguing that maybe even it should show that the U.S. means business. It's tough and it can increase. So again, it's not my view. I'm just representing, I think, some of the thinking that you do here in Washington and you see. And I think the Europeans are certainly taking this threat seriously, that the United States could pull out of this agreement. I think we should be careful about too much linkages to the North Koreans because there could be reasons that doesn't go anywhere, regardless of what happens with Iran. And let's see if that summit happens altogether.
Yes, my name is General Ahmed Timsah. I'm a retired Army General from the Lebanese Army. I have 2 questions for Mr. Tanasis. I'm always following you. And for Mr. David, I'll start with Mr. Cannabis. Well, I had my experience with the Army at our mutual borders in the south. The problem was always with the UN forces that whenever they felt there's a danger, they would pull out. And sometimes they paid heavy casualties. If you remember the 6 Spanish soldiers who were killed. My question is, if we can give more close and thanks to these forces, most of them, they are parts of the NATO. So what would be, wouldn't it be better that they say if our contingents or our people are under danger, we can come to back up them up? And for Mr. David, allow me to tell you about the problem in this world now we are seeing. It's leadership and statesmanship. No more people with they can deliver. Thank you.
I get the easier question. Well, I mean, the talking about perceptions, the new UNIFIL. So first of all, yes, I think we should all be appreciative of the efforts of these people in UNIFIL, because they're doing a great job with a crappy mandate and with very little political backing. So when I talk about the shortcomings of this channel, I don't mean to suggest that it's for lack of trying by quite a creative bunch of people who, I mean, this channel was made up. It's not even in the mandate of UNIFIL, right? They made it up, and it was a good idea, and it's great that they did it. That said, one of the big problems is the mandate, right? So no one gives about. I'm going to start cursing in the panel. UNIFIL is a political orphan. No one actually wants to invest any political commitment in it. When the mandate was negotiated at the end of the war in 2006, Hezbollah didn't want any outside supervision in the south at all. Israel wanted a NATO force to come in and actively disarm anyone with a gun in the border region. So what we got was a fantastic work of lawyering, which is a document that doesn't actually say that much. And Hezbollah could say, look, this allowed us our autonomy. And Israel says, look, this mandate says that UNIFIL should be disarming Hezbollah in the border region. And it doesn't say either of those things, right? And as it is, Hezbollah and its supporters feel that UNIFIL already is a NATO instrument that's there to disarm them and spy on them, because its main robust troops are all from NATO contributor nations. And even though there's no official link between UNIFIL and NATO, we'd be fools to think that a modern NATO army wasn't using its resources to advance its own means, as militaries and states do. So there's suspicion from that side. And on the other side, Israel complains constantly that UNIFIL isn't doing anything to disarm Hezbollah, which it isn't, because that's not its job. But in Israel's view, it should, and it's falling short. And that is a yearly crisis. Every summer, as some of you in this room know, it's an annual rite of passage to wonder if the mandate will be yanked, or what will happen when it comes up for renewal. And this is because the design is bad. The design is bad, but it's the only feasible design there was. And this goes back to Dahlia's central point, which is in a messy world, you take what you can get. You want to build security architecture? Well, you can't start with an Arab NATO, so start with what you can have. And the kind of thing you can have is UNIFIL, right? Or the situation that led to the Iran deal, which was talks in Baghdad between the Iranian ambassador and the U.S. ambassador in Baghdad. So in the middle of a U.S. invasion, occupation, civil war, and all this other mess, this channel opened and led to an agreement that, as long as it lasted, was quite novel. And sorry, I'm talking a tiny bit long because I wanted to make these points. That speaks also to the underlying thing here, which is, one, you try to create forums, and then two, you hope those forums actually talk about something of substance, because you can get all these people in the room, and then if they don't talk about anything, or they don't have any political juice back with their governments, it doesn't matter. And so you need both those things to happen. And it's a real long-term toxic problem in this region, the way in which a refusal to normalize the enemy becomes a refusal to talk secretly to the enemy about security issues. So that's forever been an issue with Israel and its adversaries, where anti-normalization, but then there's tons of back-channel communications. Same with Iran today. So how ridiculous is it that all these different contact groups around Syria, not a single one of them in a routine way put Iran, Russia, and the United States and Syrians in the same venue? It was always all but one major player. All these different Venn diagrams, and you might not have gone anywhere even if you got all those people in one room, but for God's sake, you've got to start with that, and then maybe it leads down the road to something like the Iran deal coming out of the chaos of Iraq in the early 2000s.
Yep. Shall we?
Political will. Needs political will.
Needs political will.
It's true. None of these things happen without.
I'd like to just sort of comment a bit been. I haven't served in a UN mission, but I did serve in the European Community Monitoring Mission in Yugoslavia during the war there. And one of the things that you said very much resonated with me, as did Thanasi's chapter. And one is this, well, you know, when it gets hot, you're going to leave. Well, that's part of the mandate. And we very much had this discussion, and I had this discussion with Serb, Croat, Muslim individuals. They said, well, you know, you'll leave. I had to, when I was in charge, I was responsible for the lives of my people. So that didn't give me much choice. Personally, I was quite prepared to stay there through a war. But I didn't have to worry about a family back home. But it is a perception problem. On the other hand, sometimes people will use that as an excuse. Oh, well, you know, if it all fails, it's your fault. And I had a couple of interesting conversations with body exchanges and prisoner exchanges where people would say, well, if it doesn't work, it's your fault. And I would say, no, it's not, it's yours. I don't care. I'll go home to my family, you know, 6 weeks from now. I don't care. You have to sort it out, but I will help you as much as I can. But that is a perception. But one of the most important things in these missions becomes personalities and training. And how the ability to interpret that mandate. Thanasi, you talked about there are things that this UN mission is doing that isn't really in the mandate, but the commanders have been doing it. We did something very similar. Our mandate was not to do anything humanitarian. We were there to monitor. Well, you know, we were meeting people from the same family on both sides of the lines. People would ask us to exchange letters. So my instructions to my group was our job is purely to monitor humanitarian. But to monitor, we have to talk to people. So by all means, take the letters over, talk to them. You interpret a mandate. And one of the things that you mentioned in your chapter that also resonated was how when you know you're succeeding, when both sides dislike you equally, when they each think that you're a spy for the other side, then you know you're on track. But I digress. You were asking about political leadership, and it's vital. Sometimes the cynic in me says we need a generational change. We need to wait until the younger generation takes over because they are actually communicating in ways that the older generation doesn't. Again, we go back to the Einstein thing. We need to do things differently. But I teach at a thing in Dalhousie University every summer where we bring people from around the world to do ocean governance studies, from totally different cultures, backgrounds. In some cases, it's I'm a man, so I'm going to take charge. And meanwhile, we've got some PhD woman who says, well, no, you're not. But bringing these people together, who are then talking together, they're tweeting to each other, they're emailing. This came home to me right after 9/11, after the al-Qaeda attacks in New York. I had been speaking at a university in Karachi some weeks before. And after I had been volunteering with the Red Cross, but later on, I was emailing back and forth with students from Pakistan saying, what do you think? What do you think? And I thought, what a wonderful world we live in, that in real time, I can be talking to people in Pakistan about this. So generational change would perhaps help, but we need to educate the next generation to have a different view of war and peace.
Shall we move to this?
Right, yes, hi. My name is Dina and I am a Carnegie RA. My first question is a follow-up to the points made. To what extent do we have buy-ins from Middle East states to really push for a change, push for a new security architecture, which is one key question before going through and deeper into main points and variables, pros and cons. Now, regarding the collective versus cooperative, where does the arms purchases stand in making such a shift? Because arms purchases for Middle Eastern countries is detrimental. 3, regarding the UNIFIL, how does the UNIFIL react in regards to Hezbollah's activity in the south? We know that it turns a blind eye, but what is the mechanism after seeing some sort of dodgy, skeptical act in the south? What does it do? Thank you.
A couple of more questions and then deliver a round of answers. I think Waleed in the back also had a question.
Reed Clark, Beirut. I've got a bit of a lesser amount of a naval background, but I came here hoping to hear about your ideas and initiatives. And I've lived here for too long, but there's plenty of reasons, politics and so forth, for pessimism. The key for those who are learned and want to is to see through the politics, see what's practical, see what can be done. And on the naval side, I've thought for well over a year about the 2 Mistral ships. 270-meter ships, they're the great Swiss Army knife ships of the region, 1.3 billion. They did not go to Russia. They went to Egypt with Saudi money. 28 helicopters on them each, can sail and deploy down the Red Sea, could do Eastern Mediterranean UNIFIL duty while budgets are being cut and so forth. Could do their Zur field, other fields and so forth, friendly to Israel, friendly to Lebanon. Yeah, and not friendly to Turkey, but friendly to Cyprus and so forth. That needs to come from somebody with the chutzpah that can see that a regional asset. I'm not interested in the Bangladeshis or the Indonesians getting training. The Bangladeshis are interested in the financial side of it too. But to have a Mistral ship come up here and participate when budgets are tight and so forth in the 6-ship fleet. Things like that. That's just, there's plenty of political reasons and so forth. While out of Riyadh or out of Alexandria, Cairo, they might say this isn't going to work. But you got a friendly Sunni country that wants to assume a greater power in the region. So there are many things that make sense, initiatives like that. One that I just heard of lately, and I'd like a panel comment, about which I knew nothing, is a new LAF modern regiment, which is going south of the Litani to participate in whatever they're going to do down there. So if anybody here has any knowledge on that, that's my second point. I certainly don't. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Walid Hasboun. I teach at AUB. I do want to go back to this, the political question, not trying to sidetrack things, but when David mentioned this idea about the technical solutions and the track 2 and track 1.5 and the idea of bringing solutions, security solutions to the politicians. I mean, my question about this kind of work is, to what degree is politics, across the region and elsewhere, is driven by the idea of securing the population, and and to what degree are the interests, of regimes and political elites driven by, their own political interest, and their own security is often guaranteed through their external relationships and external aid and so forth, and often it's different their societies sometimes pose threats to regime security themselves. How do you operate in such an environment would be my question.
Sure, happy to. Great questions. What does UNIFIL do when it sees dodgy activity? I think they're careful not to see any dodgy activity. These processes aren't accidental, right? They're not like buffoons stumbling around through the South. They do not ever want to see a Hezbollah weapon, and they probably haven't. So when they assure us in their reports and in private that they haven't seen this and they haven't seen that, and the surveillance footage that the Israelis give them is bogus and BS and is out of date or not real or doesn't have coordinates, yeah, probably they didn't see, and maybe those weapons aren't there, or maybe that activity is not taking place, but for sure it's not taking place in the sight of a UNIFIL person. So they don't have to have that awkward, event. Is that, should we ridicule UNIFIL for that? Well, I mean, this is one of the things people love to beat up on them for. And the part I would say is a mistake on their part is for them to pretend that, nothing bad is going on down there in the South, as opposed to saying, as far as we know. I mean, the smarter position would be to say, as far as we know, and if, given our humble mandate, there's activities going on that we can't notice, that's fair enough, So they should be a little less, I think, absolute in their certainty about what they see and what they know. But we haven't given them the tools to do more than that. So why should they? They're not a Chapter 7 peace enforcement mission, and God knows those don't work out so well either, as we see in the Congo. But like, at least there's a framework where you could have made them do that, and there wasn't the political will for that. So what they could do is more robustly monitor what's happening. They do a pretty good job. I'd say if you read those UNIFIL reports, they're a decent compilation of Israeli violations. They're not really a useful compilation of Hezbollah violations. And I think that's not wise for their own long-term viability. But if anyone in the world wanted to disarm Hezbollah, it wouldn't be UNIFIL that one would design to do that. So what's, you raise a good question, Reed. What are our creative, useful initiatives? Well, I mean, UNIFIL is one, that model. UNSCOL is another one, sort of political version of it. And I even think, I mean, when we look at UNIFIL and UNSCOL, it's like this nightmare, ridiculous setup where UNIFIL can't talk to Hezbollah, but UNSCOL, which is civilian and in Beirut, can talk to Hezbollah, and it seems ridiculous, but actually it's a great workaround, okay? You want, in practice, a tool where Hezbollah and Iran and Israel and the United States can pass information to each other. Well, this hybrid structure has enabled that. And more to the point, in this country, there are a lot of really interesting embryonic security architectures. I mean, we have, I would argue, effectively, the CIA and Hezbollah have collaborated time and again since 2011 on anti-Al-Qaeda security measures in Lebanon. Will either of those parties publicly acknowledge that? No, but there's actually been some open source public confirmation of this. That's embryonic security architecture. That's promising. Is it a game changer? No. Will it resolve? Will it bring peace to the Middle East? No. Is it meaningful? Absolutely. Another interesting one is the UK's role in helping secure the Lebanese border in very active collaboration with Hezbollah and the Lebanese Army. This is again the kind of workaround that is politically dangerous in the West, especially where you have the UK and the US ostensibly criminalizing any communication with Hezbollah, and at the same time, both those governments have been willing in practice to be very flexible about allowing de facto Western financed and supported training and partnerships with Hezbollah and the Lebanese military to counter a common security threat in the form of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. I think that, and also finally, the entire relationship of the West to the Lebanese army is a really good example of what is possible when governments are willing to allow ambiguity. These are arrangements that under scrutiny, for example, the U.S. Congress would be disastrous, right? If the U.S. Congress decided it wanted to make a full frontal issue of American relations with the Lebanese armed forces, that relationship would quickly come to an end and all the money would cease because I'm sure it violates a long list of terrorism statutes. But everyone involved acknowledges that it's actually a really good real-world solution to the absence of more formal security architecture. And those kinds of initiatives give me hope because they sound a lot like what David was doing in the 90s with these different navies and merchant marines. Actually, I don't know if you worked with merchant marines. You maybe only worked with
in the Maritime Safety Colloquium, the Track 2, most certainly we did.
So that's the same kind of like, okay, maybe this isn't going to have any political impact, maybe we'll down the road, but certainly we can actually address some real core security threats together now and see what comes out of those relationships down the road.
Thank you. I would just add something to what you said about UNIFIL, which is basically something that I've learned from conversations with UNIFIL officers, which is basically that that whenever a UNIFIL patrol encounters a number of civilians, a crowd of civilians who are actually demonstrating and shouting against UNIFIL, they understand that there's some sort of a Hezbollah activity in the region, so they tend to pull out. And when this encounter becomes a bit more intense, they understand that there is some serious
that they're too close to a rocket, let's say.
Because you have these let's say, a bunch of ladies and men and children screaming and shouting and trying to throw some stuff at the UNIFIL tanks. They understand that there's
Time to turn around.
Exactly, it's time to turn around. Exactly, try not to see anything, as Tanasi said. I'm just adding this, but please, David.
Comment on two of the questions. One on the issue of ships and equipment and capabilities. There was a wonderful Spanish diplomat called Salvador de Madariaga, who died in the 1960s, but between the two world wars, he headed the Disarmament Commission for the League of Nations. He's written some wonderful stuff on disarmament, but the line that always resonates with me is that people do not distrust each other because they are armed. They are armed because they distrust each other, which brings us back to the whole issue of confidence, trust, may not like each other, but communications. To me, that is a key issue. So ultimately, my country, Canada, lives right next door to the most mightily armed hyperpower in the history of the planet. And people forget this, up until 1900, our mutual defense plans were against each other. The world's oldest confidence-building measure that I know of still in existence is called the Rush-Bagot Agreement that was signed between then Britain, before Canada became independent, and the United States in 1817. And it was about naval arms control on the Great Lakes. That's still in force. In the 1960s, the United States talked about putting nuclear or some kind of submarines in the Great Lakes with nuclear missiles, because then the Soviets would never get it. Canada turned that down because we had a treaty. After 9/11, the U.S. Coast Guard wanted to arm its vessels, discussed it with Canada first. We agreed because we said that's policing, not military. But ultimately, it comes down to trust, not platforms. Political leadership, if one is frank, peace requires political leadership. If one is frank, however, that might very well get you assassinated in this part of the world. So it takes real political courage. And I don't think any of us should ever underestimate that. And so often it is survival. It becomes a political imperative, is survival. That's where the rest of society needs to help political leadership. What is the fundamental responsibility of political leadership? It's to provide a safe and secure environment for its people to live in prosperity. So therefore, fighting each other is in no one's interest. It is most definitely not in political interest. So anything that we can do at a working level, influential people who can go up and actually speak to politicians, young students who feel that they have got things to contribute, we all need to be helping, not to be working against our political leaders, but to help them with their fundamental responsibility, which is a safe, secure, prosperous society.
Well, I might be a little more cynical about motivations of leaders, not just in this region, but in our even our part of the world. I think political survival, whether you're a democracy or not, is a key motivating force. But I don't think, and so I think that was a really good question, but I don't think that is mutually exclusive of engaging in some of these confidence-building measures that can actually bring benefits. It's in no leader's political survival to have a nuclear disaster, catastrophe. It's in no leader's political survival to have a cholera outbreak. It's not in a political leader's interest of survival to have a major refugee flow. So I think you can leverage some of these potential achievements and package them in a context where leaders find it in their self-interest to do it. Now, to the question of where's the demand for it, I think at the moment we don't have the demand. In fact, the arms sales point links very well to this. I think the increased arms sales in the region really are a good data point to suggest the trend lines are going the opposite direction. The trend lines are going much more toward the traditional default balancing competitive alliance structures, zero-sum thinking, and for good reasons. There's plenty of mistrust and reasons for that in this region. But what I think we can do is we can leverage some of this history, we can leverage some of even the existing track twos that are going on, where they are trying to build confidence, where they're trying to understand intentions of adversaries, because some conflicts are unwanted, and they do stem from misperceptions. And getting actors in the same room can really clarify a lot of things. And so I think what we can do is we can leverage those opportunities. I think give them more support for the time when you may have a political window of opportunity. Because this is not an effort, security architectures don't happen overnight. I think all of our chapters really reinforce this. This is a generational effort. It takes time and investment, and you need to have some of these ideas in place so when there's a leader who, for political survival reasons, says, I don't think OSCE in the Middle East is actually a good idea, but he or she may say that. After the Iran deal, you actually heard a lot of leaders saying, we need an OSCE. Oh, why am I having a problem saying OSCE? I want to keep trying to say CSE. Anyway, you're going to have that moment again. You need to prepare the groundwork. And I think you got a good laundry list of things to do, and there are more. Nuclear safety is a big one right now. Another policy institute in Beirut actually wrote a very interesting paper on a multinational enrichment facility, which I think is a really interesting idea that could be built into a Track 2 form. You're not going to have the demand for nuclear power go away in this region. As a hedging strategy, you should be building on that to figure out if you can create a form of communication across Arab states and Iran, including Israel, on this question. Those are things you can practically build on. So that would be, a way of connecting. I think all those questions actually were quite related.
Thank you. Any last question from the audience? Nope. Okay.
Before we wrap, can I just say one
Yeah,
quick
yeah, please go ahead.
project itself? There are books outside for you to take, Order from Ashes, and these reports we did were all part of this 2-year project called Order from Ashes. And please, if you found what we said interesting, take a book, look at our reports online at the Century Foundation's website, tweet about them, share them with your friends, give them to them as birthday presents.
We'll sign copies.
Thanks for your attention.
Have a great rest of the evening. Cheers. Thank you.